It's the winter of 1866 inside the Summit Tunnel, 7,000 feet up in California's Sierra Nevada. A Chinese laborer is lowered on a rope through a shaft cut straight down into solid granite, 73 feet deep, to reach a tunnel face that daylight has never touched. Outside, the snow has been falling for days, and somewhere on the mountainside above him, an entire work camp is about to disappear under an avalanche that will not be found again until spring. Some of the bodies recovered months later were still gripping their picks. This is the story of the machines and the men that built the first railroad to cross the United States. Phase 1 of 7, 2 companies racing for cash. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 paid 2 competing companies by the mile of track laid in both government bonds and land grants along the route. The Union Pacific started in Omaha, Nebraska, and pushed west. The Central Pacific started in Sacramento, California, and pushed east, straight into the Sierra Nevada. The more track each company built, the more money and land it received from the federal government. It was not designed as a race, but it became one almost immediately. Behind the Central Pacific sat 4 Sacramento businessmen who would become known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. Stanford, serving simultaneously as company president and governor of California, told Congress in 1865 that without Chinese laborers, it would be impossible to finish the western half of the line within the government's required timeframe. Phase 2 of 7, an experiment with 21 men. The Central Pacific's construction boss, Charles Crocker, was desperate for labor in 1864. He tried an experiment. 21 Chinese laborers hired to see if they could handle the work. They could. By 1867, Chinese workers made up roughly 90% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce, a total that historians estimate at somewhere between 12 and 20,000 men at peak construction. They were paid between $26 and $35 a month, roughly a third less than white laborers doing the same work, and unlike white workers, they had to pay for their own food and lodging out of that wage. Many had already worked the California goldfields or come directly from Guangdong province through labor brokers in San Francisco, and most sent a portion of their wages home rather than spending it locally. Crocker organized the workforce into gangs of roughly 12 to 20 men each, with one member of every gang responsible for cooking and buying supplies. A system that let crews maintain a diet of dried vegetables, fish, and tea that white observers at the time noted seemed to keep the Chinese crews healthier than their counterparts eating standard railroad camp fare of beef and beans. Phase 3 of 7, 15 tunnels through granite. Crossing the Sierra Nevada meant boring 15 tunnels totaling over 6,000 feet through some of the hardest rock in North America. The worst was tunnel number 6, the Summit Tunnel, 1,695 feet of solid granite, drilled almost entirely by hand with 2-inch holes packed with black powder. Crews burned through as many as 500 kegs of powder a day and still advanced only inches. A chemist mixed nitroglycerin on site to speed things up, an explosive so unstable that after one disastrous accident, construction boss James Strobridge banned it outright. To attack the mountain from more angles at once, crews sank a vertical shaft down to the tunnel's midpoint and lowered men into the dark to dig outward in 4 directions simultaneously, hauling debris out by bucket on a stripped-down locomotive steam winch. Before the tunnels, there was Cape Horn, a 3-mile stretch of the route carved directly into a cliff face above the American River Canyon, with the slope angled at 75 degrees and the river more than 2,000 feet below. Workers were lowered over the edge in reed baskets, hand-drilled holes into the rock face, packed them with black powder, and set the fuses before being hauled back up. There was no machine for this. It was simply men on ropes, working a cliff wall one blast at a time, months before the tunnels through the summit even began. Crocker also tried to speed the granite work with steam-powered drills shipped in from the east, but the machines jammed constantly in the cold and broke down faster than crews could repair them, and the company eventually abandoned them in favor of men swinging sledgehammers in 3-man teams, one holding the drill bit and turning it slightly between blows, the other 2 striking it in rotation. On a good day, a team advanced the Summit Tunnel face by roughly a foot. At that rate, engineers calculated it would take years to finish the mountain crossing unless the multiple face strategy through the vertical shaft was adopted, which is exactly what happened. Phase 4 of 7, the winter that buried men where they stood. The winter of 1866 to 1867 brought 44 separate storms to the summit. Snowpack averaged 18 feet deep. Camps and entire tunnel crews vanished under slides with no warning. Engineer John Gillis later wrote that no one could face the worst of those storms and survive it in the open. 20 men were killed in a single avalanche that winter, and workers described finding frozen bodies the following spring still gripping their picks and shovels. To keep trains running through future winters, crews eventually built 37 miles of wooden snow sheds covering the most exposed stretches of track through the mountains, an entire secondary construction project layered on top of the railroad itself. Historians' estimates of Chinese worker deaths from accidents, explosions, and exposure during the railroad's construction range as widely as from several hundred to over 1,000, a spread that exists because company payroll and death records for immigrant laborers were kept poorly, if at all. Phase 5 of 7, the strike nobody remembers. In June of 1867, several thousand Chinese workers along the Sierra Nevada line walked off the job. They demanded wages equal to white laborers, a shorter workday, and better treatment underground. Crocker's response was to cut off their food and transportation, stranding the strikers in isolated mountain camps until hunger forced them back to work 8 days later. They did not win equal pay, but wages did rise substantially within the following year, and historians now describe the walkout as one of the largest labor actions in American history up to that point. If stories like this are worth your time, hit that subscribe button, because it genuinely helps this kind of forgotten history find the people who'd want to see it. Phase 6 of 7, racing across the flat. While the Central Pacific fought granite 1 foot at a time, the Union Pacific crossed open prairie, laid mostly by Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans working for the company Grenville Dodge oversaw as chief engineer. Dodge had commanded troops during the war and ran his construction crews with the same military discipline, moving entire mobile towns of workers, saloons, and supply depots forward along the line as it advanced, towns that came to be known as Hell on Wheels. Without mountains to slow it down, Union Pacific crews sometimes laid more than 10 miles of track in a single day, a speed the Central Pacific's tunnel gangs could only envy from 3,000 miles away. The flat terrain brought its own dangers instead of granite ones: conflict with Native American tribes whose land the railroad was cutting directly through, and the logistics of supplying thousands of workers across open plains with no local towns to draw from. Phase 7 of 7, a golden spike and an empty photograph. The two lines finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10, 1869. A ceremonial golden spike was driven into the final tie while a crowd of railroad officials and workers gathered for photographs. Of the roughly 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers who had built most of the western half of the railroad, not one appears in the most famous photograph taken that day. Their camps, by that point, were scattered miles from the ceremony, and the men considered notable enough to photograph were, almost without exception, company officials. The railroad cut a journey that had once taken months down to about a week. It reduced transportation costs across the country by a huge margin, lowering travel expenses for goods and passengers by as much as 85%, and directly led the United States to adopt standardized time zones in 1883 so that railroad schedules could actually make sense from state to state. Within a few years, it had also enabled entirely new businesses, including the first mail-order catalog companies, which depended on exactly the kind of fast, predictable cross-country shipping the railroad now made possible. It also, less celebrated at the time, accelerated the displacement of Native American communities across the plains the tracks now crossed, opening land to settlement that had previously been far harder to reach. What's left of the physical construction is mostly gone. The Summit Tunnel still exists, hand-carved granite walls bearing the marks of drills swung by men whose names were mostly never written down. The steam winches, the kegs of black powder, the sledges and picks were used up or scrapped generations ago. What remains is the fact of the thing itself. 2 lines of steel, laid from opposite oceans, meeting in the Utah desert 5 years ahead of what many engineers at the time believed was possible.